Hello, and welcome back to another episode of 8-Bit Monsters Monster Deconstruction for D&D 5th Edition. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at the Copper Dragon Wyrmling. This chaotic good dragon is rated at CR1, which nets players a 200 XP bonus if they defeat or otherwise encounter the dragon. This Wyrmling also has a natural armor of 16, just based off of its hard copper armor that it wears naturally. And by looking at Xanathar's Guide for Encounter Building, we'll see that it takes 5 level 1 players to face off against this one CR1 Wyrmling. At level 2, it'll take 3 players to face off against this Wyrmling, and at level 3, it'll take at least 2 players to face off against the Wyrmling, and once players hit level 4, they can face off with a Wyrmling rated at CR1 on a 1-to-1 basis. Now let's move on to the TLDW. This Wyrmling is rated with a DCR of 1, an OCR of 3, and a final CR of 2. If you're interested to find out why, keep listening and we'll continue on to see what's going on here. Next, let's take a look at the skills and traits. The Wyrmling actually has a bunch of saves, and because it has saves, we're going to be adding its proficiency bonus to the save traits. Now, the proficiency bonus for this Wyrmling, being only at CR1, is going to be a +2, so we're adding +2 to all of the stats listed. And for this Wyrmling, its saves are Dex +3, Constitution +3, Wisdom +2, and Charisma +3. Now, because it has saves in these stats, we're adding the +2 bonus to all of those. So if you were to look at the Wyrmling's stats, you'll see why it has a higher rated save than its actual stats. Now, because this Wyrmling has 4 actual saves, we have to give it a little bonus to its armor class because it's able to fend off spells and abilities that will use these saves. Due to this, we'll add a +2 effective AC bonus to our Wyrmling once we get to the DCR section. Next, let's take a look at some of the skills it has. And luckily, the Wyrmling only has 2 skills, with Perception, which is a +4 coming from a Wisdom of +0, Proficiency of +2, and more than likely also being an expert as well, giving another +2. On top of that, the Wyrmling also has Stealth, which at this point we're seeing a lot of monsters with bonuses to Stealth, oddly enough. Looking at the Stealth score, we'll see that the +3 comes from its Dex bonus of +1 and only being proficient with a +2. Some other things to note here are that it has a damage immunity to acid, since we'll also note that it breathes acid, therefore it's going to be immune to any acid damage. Now that we've looked over the skills section of the Wyrmling, we'll see that the Wyrmling also has no traits, so we can skip over the rest of this section and move on to the DCR. But before we get to that, there's one last thing to note here, and that's the fact that it has a flying skill, and it can breathe a weapon attack. So this gives the Wyrmling an extra little bonus because it can fly and deal damage at range with players anywhere under level 10. And due to the fact that the Wyrmling can fly and cause damage with a breath attack, we also give the Wyrmling another +2 effective AC bonus. So now we're at a +4 bonus to its effective AC because of the 4 saves that it has, and the fact that it can fly and deal ranged damage. So we'll just keep that in mind once we get to the DCR, which is coming up. Looking at our DCR now, we'll see that the effective hit points are 22, coming from a 48 +4. Now, there's nothing else affecting our Wyrmling here to increase its hit points, so we can go right to the fact that it effectively has 22 hit points on average. If we next look at the natural armor that it has of 16, coming from its brass plating, there's nothing else also affecting the armor class here. So we can then look at our chart and see that the effective hit points of 22 nets us at a DCR of 1/8. A DCR of 1/8 is expected to have 13 AC. Because our Wyrmling has an actual AC of 16, we would increase that a little bit, but we have to add the +4 effective bonus from the saves and the fact that it can fly and deal ranged damage. So the effective AC is actually going to be a 20. This is quite a jump over the expected AC of 13 for a CR 1/8. And because there is a +7 bonus over the expected 13, we're going to have a +3 shift upwards on our chart. So this moves our DCR from 1/8 all the way up to 1. Since we found the DCR at 1, this is actually kind of surprising considering our printed value for our Wyrmling is a CR1 as well. This is the first time we've seen this. Normally their DCR is going to be a lot lower than what's printed, and the attack is going to balance that out. But as we may see when we get to the OCR section, things can get a little wacky with the Dragon's Breath. Moving on to the OCR, we'll take a look at the two different types of attacks that the Wyrmling has. First, we'll see that the Wyrmling has a bite attack, and the bite is rated at 7.5 damage per round at 1d10 plus 2. This isn't a lot of damage and will make the dragon considerably weaker versus the other attack it has. But its actual attack bonus and its effective attack bonus is +4 because there's nothing else affecting the attack bonus. So when we look at the chart for the Wyrmling's bite, we'll see that the bite rates us at a CR 1/2, and its expected attack bonus is a +3. Its actual effective attack bonus is a +4, so this is only 1 over the expected, and there's no shift at all to the OCR. So for the bite, our OCR is a 1/2. But the Wyrmling also has 2 other attacks it can do as actions. These are breath weapons. The first breath weapon is an acid breath. The other breath attack is a slow breath, but because the slow doesn't actually do any kind of damage, we're going to ignore that for the OCR section. So let's look at the acid breath and see what's going on here. Now if we explore the rules for monster traits and breath attacks, we'll have to assume 2 failed saves when the breath weapon hits. Because the acid breath deals 48 damage normally, we'll multiply that by 2, giving us an average of 36 actual damage for the acid breath. That's a lot of damage, and we'll see where that comes in a little bit once we look at its difficulty check. The Wyrmling has an actual DC of 11 for its acid breath, and this is also the effective DC since there's nothing modifying the DC for the acid breath. We'll take a look at the chart and compare the 36 damage to find that our OCR is rated at 5. That's disturbing. The offensive combat rating for our Wyrmling's acid breath is a CR 5. It's only rated at CR 1. Wow, so much damage here. Oh goodness. Looking at its expected DC, we'll see that the DC is supposed to be a 15, but because the Wyrmling's DC check is only 11, it's actually -4 under the expected, which, following the rules, we have to shift the OCR 5 down -2 to OCR 3. That's still impressive for a printed CR1 value with a DCR of 1 or potentially even less, depending on the flying rules, which could be added in or not because of its breath attack and flying. So we have a final OCR of 3 for our Copper Dragon Wyrmling here. I'll explain more in the notes as to what may be going on here, but with that, let's jump right into the final combat rating. The final combat rating can be taken a couple different ways based off if the Wyrmling gets its dragon breath back every turn or not. So let's take a look at the Wyrmling if it gets all 3 breath attacks in the first 3 rounds of combat. We'll have a DCR of 1, plus an OCR of 3, which equals to 4, and then we average that out to a 2. Our Copper Dragon Wyrmling, with 3 breath attacks, and probably flying, will have a final combat rating of 2, which is 1 step higher than the printed value. Not terrible, and still dealing a ton of damage, especially if our players can't attack it from the air. Now let's take a look and see what happens if the dragon only gets 2 breath attacks and has to deal 1 bite attack somewhere in there. Once again, our DCR is a 1, plus an OCR of 2, and this comes from looking at the final OCR ratings for its bite plus its breath attack and then averaging those out. We take the 2 and the 1, add them together, get a 3, and then we average that out to a final combat rating of 1.5. And because of the rules, do we round that down or do we round that up to 1 or a 2? This is where it gets a little wacky. Honestly, I would think that it might be a 2 again, just because of how much damage the breath attack could be doing, especially if it's hitting more than just 2 players. More than likely, a dragon is going to save its breath attack for when it can deal multiple targets damage. And then finally, let's take a look at if it only gets 1 breath attack off and has to make a bunch of bites. The DCR would be a 1, the OCR would be 1, which totals out to 2, and then averages out to 1 for a final combat rating of 1. This is coupled with the DCR going to be, our printed value. So if our Dragon Wyrmling only gets 1 breath attack off, we have the printed value. If it gets more than 1 breath weapon in the first 3 rounds of combat, then this is going to be a crazy high damaging Wyrmling and could be some serious trouble for our players. Now that we've looked at the final combat rating and found it to be, at maximum, a 2, let's take a look at the notes and see what's going on here. The first note I'd like to talk about is flying and the breath weapon AC bonus. This was a tricky point to consider since it doesn't always have a way to make ranged attacks and fly at the same time, so I wasn't quite sure if I should give it the effective +2 AC bonus or not. If it doesn't get the AC bonus, it doesn't drastically change the final rating really all that much. Now, if it does, well, we just review what I've been talking about and see that, it could be anywhere between a 2 to a 1, or potentially even a final combat rating of 1/2 if it gets no damage at all from its breath weapon. The next point I'd like to talk about is the breath weapon recharge. It has roughly a 33 1/3 repeated % chance of recharging every turn. That's on the lower end, so the chances of actually getting the breath weapon back every turn are on the lower side. But if the DM is rolling really well that night, who knows, this Wyrmling could have the breath weapon back every turn, especially if combat goes beyond 3, 4, 5 rounds. This Wyrmling could be a massive hazard for our players if it's getting its breath attack back every round. And that's not to consider if it uses the slow or not as well. And lastly, as I described in the final combat rating section, following the rules of 3 rounds of combat, the Wyrmling more than likely can use its breath attack on the very first round of combat, provided the players haven't spread out. Otherwise, it may not get its breath weapon attack back right away, or it could use the breath weapon on the 3rd round of combat, still looking for that perfect layout. If this is the case and the Wyrmling hasn't used it right away or only gets 1 chance, then the Wyrmling is going to be a CR1 like it's printed. Otherwise, there's chances of it being a CR2 or potentially even worse, depending on how much damage that breath weapon attack deals. And that's the key point here. How much damage is that acid breath actually doing every round? That's going to be the key point, the acid breath with this monster. But it's chaotic good, so unless the players are forcing the Wyrmling's hand, more than likely the players aren't going to actually be fighting this since it's a good dragon. But who knows, it could be mind controlled, the players could be trying to steal its hoard of goodies. Anything could happen. Players want their XP and they think they have to kill to get that XP. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed another episode of 8-Bit Monsters Monster Deconstruction for D&D 5th edition. Come back next week as we take a look at another monster and deconstruct it down to its barest parts. Until next time, when we deconstruct another monster from D&D 5th edition, take care everyone, and I'll see you next time.